Today I want to examine why you Chinese students behave the way you do. Okay? So believe it or not, but the way that you behave, the game that you're playing, it's strange, it's weird. So I'll point out 3 things that you do that don't really make any sense. The first thing that you do is you spend a lot of your time learning English. In fact, you probably spend more time learning English than you do learning Chinese. That's weird. And I've asked Chinese students before why they are so focused on learning English. And their answers usually are, I want to learn knowledge, I want to go abroad, I want to communicate, I want to use the internet. That's not really a good explanation, okay? So that's one thing that's weird. Second thing that's weird is you're obsessed with making money, especially US dollars. Okay, and the third thing that's weird is that your goal in life is to immigrate to a Western country, specifically the United States, right? You all want to go to the United States for college, get a degree, and hopefully stay there, get a good job. But as we discussed before, that's strange because you are much higher status in China. You're much more likely to get a good job. You're much more likely to marry a beautiful woman than you are in the United States, where the game is rigged against you. Okay? So this sort of behavior is weird. If you think about it, what you should be really trying to do is master Chinese. Because once you master Chinese, and given your family background, given the fact that your family is often wealthy and well connected in China, you can climb up pretty high in China. Okay? So if you learn Chinese, you're far better able to communicate yourself. You're far more likely to gain respect and status in China. Okay? But instead you learn English. US dollars doesn't make any sense. What you really want is status. Right? What you really want is to be well respected. You want a prestigious job. You want to marry a beautiful woman. You want to have lots and lots of children. That's what you really want. But instead, you're really focused on obtaining US dollars. That's kind of strange. Now, the last thing we said was immigration. If you go to the United States, it's really a rigged game against you, right? The most that you can hope to obtain is maybe become an engineer or professor if you're really, really smart, but you're not going to achieve political power. You're not going to become a CEO of a major company. All right? So the situation as it is, it's really weird where the best and brightest in China, they just want to be common people in the United States or Britain or Canada. So it's a really weird game. And so the question I want to look at today is, how was this game constructed? Why do we play this game? And the answer I will show you is because of the British. Okay? The British Empire created this game that ultimately the Americans inherit, and which the entire world's played today because America is the global superpower. Okay? Does that make sense? All right. So first, I want to go into some history and explain to you how we got to where we are. So this is the map of the Spanish Empire at the height of its power. As you can see, the Spanish Empire covered the entire globe. Okay? So this is a small nation in Spain, and it was able to really cover the entire world. So how was this accomplished? Okay, so the first thing you need to understand is that for most of its history, Europe was a very poor place. In order for it to obtain wealth, it had to trade with the world. Specifically, it wanted spices from what they call the East Indies, okay, Southeast Asia. At this time in history, the main power were the Muslims who are here, okay? And if you wanted to trade with East Asia, you have to go through the Muslims. And at this point in history, Spain is Muslim. It's a place called Andalusia. But then the Christians were able to reconquer Spain. And so the Muslims decided that, we'll just blockade you. Or if you want to trade with us, we will charge you a lot of levies. Okay? And so now the Spanish and the Portuguese are forced to look for new routes to the East Indies, where the spices are. Remember, at this time in history, spices are the most valuable commodity. They're actually worth more than gold. Okay? I'm talking about like cinnamon, nutmeg, peppercorn. Okay? These spices are extremely valuable commodities. In fact, one ship, if you're able to bring one ship of these spices back to Europe, well, you had intergenerational wealth. Okay? You become one of the wealthiest people in Europe. That's how valuable these spices were. And so now, the Spanish and the Portuguese have no choice but to discover new routes to the East Indies. So they went this way, and this is hard because Africa is not really hospitable. There are a lot of viruses, diseases in Africa. So they started to explore all around the world, and they went to North America and South America. And when they went to North and South America, they discovered that there were already peoples, the Aztecs, the Incas, living there. And they had a lot of wealth because these were empires, and they could be easily conquered. And so they set up these colonies all around South America, and a lot of silver was now being transported back to Spain. And so overnight, Spain became extremely wealthy. But as we discussed last class, if you become too wealthy and too powerful, you change as a people. Before you were energetic, you were open, you were cohesive. That's what made you an empire. But now because of all this wealth, you become insular. You become arrogant. And you become extremely close-minded. Okay, you become lazy. And so the Spanish, they had all this wealth, and they decided that they really want to work anymore. Okay, so what happened? Well, what happened was that they started to subcontract their labor to other places. Okay, so now what's going to happen is you will have the rise of England, French, and the Dutch Republic. Mainly, okay, to provide textiles, luxury goods to Spain, all right? So how this was accomplished was first, industry. So the Spanish, because they were so wealthy, didn't want to work. And their people didn't have to work either, okay? So, but they wanted to buy clothes, nice clothes. So what happened was they got other nations to be their factories, including Britain, the Dutch Republic, and France. Okay, that's the first thing. Second thing that happened was trade. Okay, so the Spanish did engage in trade, but now that they're so wealthy, they could just hire the Dutch to do it. Okay, now the Dutch were responsible for going to the East Indies and bringing back the spices because it's a very dangerous job. Right? You could get sick, you could die along the way. You could also lose a lot of money. Okay? And the reason why the Dutch agreed to this is that the Dutch was basically a colony of the Spanish. So the Spanish had an empire, and the Dutch were part of this empire, so they just made the Dutch go do it for them. Okay? But the third thing that happened was piracy. Okay? So all this silver was being transported from the New World back to Spain. And what the English realized is, hey, we can just engage in piracy and steal this silver for ourselves. Okay? All right, so now the English became very wealthy because of piracy. Okay, and the most famous pirate of this time, of course, was Sir Francis Drake. And he worked directly under the monarch, Elizabeth I. Okay, so this was a state-sponsored piracy that made Britain very wealthy. Okay, so now you have this divergence where, okay, you have the Spanish Empire, and because of their wealth, they became lazy, insular, and arrogant. Or the word we use is hubris. Okay, lazy is you just make others do it for you, okay? Insular just means that now, as we discussed last class, the Spanish aren't concerned about other nations. They think they're invincible, so they engage in court politics. Okay? They're all infighting for the throne. The last thing is arrogant hubris, which basically means that you believe you are invincible. You can do whatever you want, and therefore you start all these wars against everyone, everywhere. You overextend yourself, and you don't really understand your limitations as an empire. So very quickly, even though Spain becomes very wealthy very fast, they also go bankrupt very fast because they're fighting too many wars, they're spending too much money that they don't have. Okay, and they're too corrupt. Okay, does that make sense? Now, and because of this, what's happening is that the British, England, the Dutch, and the French, they are slowly becoming a much more energetic, open, and cohesive society. Cohesion, okay? And now that you have this differentiation, what's going to happen is that their religion is going to change. Okay? So Spain remains Catholic. And it's going to fight to control the Vatican. And this, okay? So that's what Spain does. Now, Britain and the Dutch need to differentiate themselves from Spain. And so they become Protestant, or we call Calvinists. Okay? So Catholic is really about obeying authority. But the Protestant, the Calvinist religion insists on hard work, on energy, on obtaining wealth. Okay? The problem, though, is that the Spanish are too powerful. And the French, some of them are Calvinists, but most are Catholic. Okay? So what's going to happen is that the English and the Dutch are going to decide to join forces. Okay? So I want to very quickly show you the difference between the Catholic religion and the Protestant religion. Okay? So these are the Spanish. And as you can see, there's a lot of trade going between the New World and Spain. Why is this the case? Because Spain is extracting resources from the New World, primarily silver. Okay? The French are also engaged in trade as well. So what they really want is fur from North America. So fur is considered a luxury at that time. But as you can see from this map, the people that are really engaged in trade, engaged in piracy, in trade, in shipping, are the British, okay, and the Dutch. And the reason why is that they're poor, okay? And so through this hard work, they become very wealthy very quickly. In fact, the Dutch, become the wealthiest nation in the world per capita. You have this burgeoning of the middle class. And so what happens now is that the Spanish and the Dutch come into conflict. Because remember, the Dutch are a colony of the Spanish. And so the Spaniards want the Dutch to pay more taxes, and the Dutch want to be more independent. So this starts a series of wars, okay? In fact, an entire series of wars starts throughout Europe called the 30 Years' War. Okay? So ostensibly, it's a religious conflict between the Protestants and the Catholics, but there are lots of there are other underlying factors as well. Okay? Another factor is the Spaniards want to exert control over the Dutch. Okay? And so there's lots of different reasons, but the main thing you need to know is that millions and millions of people die. In fact, it is the deadliest war in Europe right before, up until the World War I. Okay? And so this creates anxiety in Europe, because if there's all this war and you're generating all this wealth, how do you keep this wealth secure? Right? You're a merchant, you became very wealthy through trade by going to the East Indies and getting spices and come back to Europe and selling them. But if the Spanish or the French are going to send an army and steal everything, how do you keep your gold safe? Okay? So what's going to happen is this. What's going to happen is that the British and the Dutch are going to decide to get married. Okay? This is what we call the Glorious Revolution. 1688 Glorious Revolution. So let's talk about the Glorious Revolution. In the Glorious Revolution, what happens is that the British nobility invite William of Orange, who is a leader of the Dutch Republic, to come and become the monarch of Britain. Okay? And so you're like, okay, why would they do that? Why would they betray their own king, James II, and install a foreign monarch, William of Orange? Okay? And so the thing you need to understand is that throughout British history, what makes Britain unique is that the monarch has always been in conflict with the nobility. Okay? The king has always been in conflict with the oligarchs. And this is a continuous pattern. So ostensibly, the reason is religious, because James II was Catholic and Britain is a Protestant country. But the real reason is the nobility want to exert authority over the country. Okay? So in this agreement, what would happen is that Parliament becomes the sovereign state, okay? It becomes the de facto power in England. And the king, William Orange, agrees to be the puppet or the figurehead, but the real power is in Parliament. And so this creates the idea of national sovereignty. Okay? What people don't appreciate is that the real reason why they want to do that is they want to protect capital. Okay? Capital. Okay, or transnational. So the idea is that not only does William of Orange come over, but most of Dutch wealth come over. Because remember, at this time, the Dutch have a huge problem. They're constantly being invaded by Spain. So what you do is you take all the gold in the Dutch Republic and you transfer over it to England, okay? And so in 1694, they create something called a Bank of England. All right? And the Bank of England, the idea is this. The idea is that if you buy in the Bank of England, that gold is yours, okay? But the Bank of England will always be guaranteed by Parliament. All right, so this is a very important idea, guys. I need you to understand this for the rest of the semester, okay? So before, if you're a king and you need to go fight a war, you would borrow money from bankers and merchants, right? The problem, though, is that, one, you could lose the war, in which case, oops. Second is that you could die, in which case, oops. And the third problem is that you could just say, I'm king, I'm not going to give you back your money, okay? And so these merchants would have no choice but to try to create a revolution, okay? But as a merchant, as a capitalist, you don't want to go through this process. And so the Bank of England, it's really important because now you are lending money not to the king, but to the nation. Okay? What this means is that the nation has to pay you back. So even though the king dies, the people are liable for the debt. Okay, does that make sense? All right? So now, if you're a merchant, you feel safe. I can now put my money in the Bank of England. It's my money. If I lend it to the nation, I'm always guaranteed that they'll pay me back. Okay? And England is safe because, unlike the Dutch Republic, England is an island, and therefore it's protected by the Royal Navy. It's impossible for the French, the Habsburg Empire, or the Spanish to invade England. They've never been able to conquer England, and so it makes England safe, okay? All right? So now the question is, why would the Dutch, why would they put their money in England? Because remember, at this time, they can just screw you over, okay? So the way around this is you have some old techniques. You have intermarriage, right? And then you have religion, or what we call secret societies. Because remember, both the Dutch Republic and England are Calvinists, okay? And the major secret society that facilitated trade, of course, were the Freemasons. But during this time, these two were really between aristocrats. And the Bank of England was trying to get as much money as possible, right? So what they started to develop was a new concept. It's not a new concept, but they really systemized it. It's called contract law. All right, so there's a famous British philosopher named John Locke. And he said that what is government for? Government provides the inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. All right? What that means is a government ensures you three rights. We will protect your safety. We'll make sure you won't die. Okay? We will make sure you have the right to do whatever you want, liberty, and also we will protect your private property. Okay? The entire purpose of Parliament and the courts, okay, the judicial system, is to ensure that your private property is protected, no matter where your private property came from. Okay? Doesn't matter. They don't care what the origin of private property is. Okay? So, like, if you're French and you killed 1 million people to steal 1 million gold, they don't care. It's yours. It's private. Okay? If it's and they believe that this private property comes from God. All right? This is yours because God willed it to be yours, and we, England, must protect it. And they will do so through Parliament and through the court system. Okay? Does that make sense? So now, if you're wealthy in Europe, you're now encouraged to go invest in England. Okay? And this creates a concept that today we call offshore financial center, or OFC. Okay, so think of like Dubai or Hong Kong, where they don't care where the money comes from. Okay? Their legal system, the financial system will help protect this money. Okay? Also Switzerland. Okay, so Switzerland is a classic example. But England create this, and they base their entire nation around this idea. Okay? Now, the first major test to the system was Napoleon, because Napoleon was about to conquer Europe, and England couldn't have that, because if Napoleon conquers Europe, then Napoleon could control all the wealth of Europe. He could make sure that no wealth is transferred over to England. He could basically blockade England. So what Britain did was they financed 7 wars against Napoleon. And they lost 6 of these wars. And they won the last war, which created the British Empire. Okay? So now Britain is a global financial empire. Okay, so this is the East India Company.